conflict.
What was your branch of service?
United States Army,
What was your highest rank?
first lieutenant.
And what general locations did you serve?
I served in 3 corps, Tay Ninh Province, Phuc Ninh District. It's pretty much on the western side, southern western side of 3 corps, bordering the Cambodian border.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted.
Where were you living at the time when you were drafted?
I was a sophomore. I was a student at the University of South Florida. I had a 2S deferment. Unfortunately, I dropped a course that I was failing, and my deferment went from 2S, the student deferment, to 1A. That summer, that was the spring of my sophomore year. That summer I went to New York. I found employment on Wall Street, and I really loved the work I was doing there. And I guess I was in a state of denial, because shortly thereafter I received my reclassification to 1A. And I said, okay, and as we proceeded through the summer, I was required to report for a physical examination at, I think it was Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, New York. And very shortly after that, probably a couple of months, maybe a little after Christmas, this had to be, I believe, 1967, I was ordered to report for induction into the United States Army.
Okay. Tell me about your first days in service.
Okay. That same day that we went to Fort Hamilton to be inducted, I was on an airplane and ended up in Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, where I was to begin my basic training. Part of the orientation before we actually were assigned to a platoon to begin our training, the Army had us do, we took numerous, I'm going to call them intelligence tests. I guess they were trying to determine what we would be best suited for. As a result of those tests, I was asked, I was given 2 opportunities actually I was in basic training at the time. They told me that I qualified for 2 programs. One was Warrant Officer Flight Training program at Fort Walters, Texas. You would learn to fly helicopters and become a warrant officer. Not quite a commissioned officer, but between enlisted and commissioned officers. And after the training, it was required that you would owe Uncle Sam in the military 3 years of active duty, and was told that I would probably spend not 1 but 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. And I said, okay, I'll think about that. The next opportunity they presented to me was to become a commissioned officer. And the problem, there was really no problem with that, except that the only branches they were offering a commission in were the combat arms, infantry, artillery, or combat engineers. And if I chose to go into one of those programs, after training, it was only a 2-year requirement of service of active duty. So wasn't really sure if I wanted to do 3 full years, and that's after training, so you're talking about almost a 4.5-year commitment. I decided to go with the Corps of Engineers, and after completing training, I had 8 weeks of basic training, then 8 additional weeks. All this was at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. 8 additional weeks of advanced individual training. However, because I was going to LCS, my individual training was in infantry, 11B40. And then after that, I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for 6 months of officer candidate school.
And how was your training at, what was it,
What, Jackson or
Fort Belvedere?
Fort Belvoir? It's in.
Belvoir?
It's
How was your training there?
was miserable.
Any notable experiences?
You have to understand the OCS program, although it's only 6 months long, is pretty much based on the United States Military Academy. You go in, you're basically an underclassman, and you endure all types of harassment and stress situations. They basically are trying to weed you out and see if you're capable of handling leadership positions in the military. I think overall we graduated probably about only 30% of the initial group that that arrived for training in officer candidate school. I would say probably 15 or 20% of the candidates that arrived would commit honor violations the very first week because they wanted no part of it. It was very, very difficult. I'm talking about meals were eaten on the first 6 inches of your chair. You ate a square meal. You answered questions constantly from upperclassmen and your tactical officers. And it was very, very stressful. As you progressed through the system, you became a junior candidate with a little bit more responsibility. You were put into leadership positions, along with the very rigorous schooling. We went to classes each day for engineering and pretty much engineering and infantry tactics. Finally, you reached the 3rd level of a senior candidate, where now you were taking the next group of undergraduates that came in and giving them the harassment that you got when you started. Eventually, after the 6 months, I was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant. At the very end of OCS, I believe he was an Army major that was commissioned in the Intelligence Corps, came to speak to our group. And he was saying that not all of us would be commissioned in the Corps of Engineers. That there was this new program that the Army was getting involved in called the Phoenix program, and that they were looking for people that had an aptitude for intelligence, and he was very vague about the Phoenix program at that time. But was saying that, you're going to be military intelligence, and he was talking about, white uniforms in Panama, talking about tours of duty in, Japan and Germany, South Korea. Never once mentioned Vietnam. I said, well, this is for me. This is exactly what I want to do. And they gave us this test with a fake language to determine our aptitude for learning a new language. And I said, what the heck is this? And I was saying, well, okay, we took the tests, and myself and several other of the senior candidates that I were with, I guess we did quite well on this test. And upon commissioning, I was told that I would go to Monterey, California, to the United States Defense Language Institute, and I would take 32 weeks of Vietnamese language. So, well, there goes Panama in the white uniform.
Can you tell me anything about your instructors while at boot camp and AIT?
Yes, my instructors at boot camp and AIT were pretty much NCOs that had served at least one tour of duty in Vietnam. They were, I have to say, the training there was excellent. I mean, again, very stressful, very tiring. We pretty much had a full day from, probably 5 o'clock in the morning until whenever. But the physical conditioning was absolutely wonderful. I never felt better in my life. I could literally run forever and not get tired. And I have to say that the training was appropriate for what was going to happen. 90% of the people, of course, that were being, their MOS was going to be 11B40 in the infantry. And believe me when I tell you, the 11 B-40s in Vietnam had it absolutely the worst. The worst conditions you could ever imagine, many, many days in a row, sometimes weeks in the field, sleeping on the ground every night in a hole. I didn't quite have it that bad. But I would have to say the training overall was excellent.
So after you were commissioned, you went to California?
Yes.
And how was that?
That was the best tour of duty you could ever imagine. Myself and 2 other lieutenants had a beautiful house right on Pacific Grove, California. We were right on the beach. My only military duty was to attend classes 5 hours a day at the Defense Language Institute to learn Vietnamese. We did have to make a commitment each evening as far as studying time to be prepared for the classes the next day. But if you've never been to the Monterey Peninsula in California, it is absolutely gorgeous, and it is just a beautiful place with wonderful temperatures. The scenery is magnificent. The base itself was on a hill overlooking the Monterey Bay. The fishing boats would come in every night. It was really wonderful duty. I had a terrific time there.
So you had some time off while you were there?
Oh yes, oh yes. Every weekends were off. I used to go down to Big Sur. I bought a motorcycle out there. I used to, every Saturday or Sunday, we'd take a ride on the 17-mile drive around Pebble Beach, and it was wonderful. I had a great time there.
And after that course, where did you go?
I ended up back once again back on the East Coast at Fort Holabird in Maryland, and for an 8-week military intelligence course. That was something new, but it didn't really get involved with the Phoenix program at that point. I didn't actually receive Phoenix training until I got to Vietnam, and that's a whole nother story. Can we take a little break here? Just get a sip of water. Okay.
So about how long were you at the intelligence school?
That was an 8-week course.
And after that course, where did you end up?
After that course, I then went back across the country and reported to, I think it was Trefz Air Force Base, to catch a flight to Vietnam.
What was your first impression on landing in Vietnam?
As the air. First of all, it's a long flight, and we left Travis, San Francisco. We went to Honolulu, Hawaii. We actually stayed there for a while. There were some problems with the plane. We then flew on to Guam, and eventually into Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Vietnam. The one thing I noticed is on approach and looking out the window, it was just bomb crater after bomb crater after bomb crater. It looked like the moon. Everything was just one giant bomb crater. It was indescribable. I had no idea what it was going to look like. However, we did arrive in Tan Son Nhut. My first impression was that I had never seen heat like this in my life. Of course, I had taken my shoes off in the plane, which was a big mistake. My feet were swollen from sitting for so long. And then to walk out on that tarmac and get blasted with that heat was absolutely incredible. The first thing we did, and I have it someplace here and I'll show it to you, is we all went into a room and the Army made us send out this postcard telling our family that we arrived safely in a war zone. It was a cruel joke. I have the postcard here if you want to see it. And anyway, later that day, We then got onto a bus, and I noticed that the bus had these iron bars all around all the windows, I guess to keep people from throwing grenades into the bus. And we got on the bus and we continued on to Benoit, another air base, and the headquarters for MACV, which is where I was going to be assigned. MACV is the Military Advisory Command Vietnam. On the bus ride, we passed through the Saigon fish market. The smell alone would cut your clothes in half. And, you know, I said, well, this is really different. And we went to Benoit, and we were put into barracks, and we were there, I think it was around 2 or 3 days. We attended classes in introducing us to the culture, the people, what to expect, what was going to happen before we were assigned to a unit where we would go. And basically MACV's units were advisory teams. And eventually I was assigned to Advisory Team 90, which I told you before was Tay Ninh Province in 3 Corps. And I started out at the province level in Tay Ninh. I was there, at the province level, it was pretty secure. It was a good-sized compound. We had Cambodian guards that provided 24-hour-a-day security on the compound. We had a regular mess hall with American food, and you could pretty much go around the town in a Jeep. I would carry a sidearm. I didn't carry a weapon at that time. And I was there, and it was quite boring. I would review photographs, intelligent documents, did some interrogating of prisoners, and also they had, are you familiar with the Chu Hoi program, the Open Arms program? Okay. The Chu Hoi program was an open arms program that the government of South Vietnam would offer to the Viet Cong if they were tired of doing what they were doing. It was called an open arms program, where they would be received by the government of South Vietnam, and they would be interned in a re-education situation, where these people were basically welcomed. They were well fed, any medical conditions were taken care of, but they were required to attend re-indoctrination programs into the South Vietnamese government. These people were a valuable source of intelligence. They weren't always forthcoming with information, but a lot of them were. They welcomed this new program. I also suspect that many of them were there, and they were still VC sympathizers, and they were eventually going to leave, and they were finding out as much about us as we were finding about them. While I was at the province level, we then, oh, that's right, I was then told that I was going to be assigned to the Phoenix program, and that I would receive training, and it was in a different part of Vietnam. It was in a coastal town, Vung Tau, which is a beautiful seacoast town. You know, I mean, you could look at it and say, you know, this is the Miami Beach of South Vietnam. It was, the hotels were a little bit nicer. The quarters that we stayed in were a little bit nicer. But again, once again, I was in class. I think that program lasted about 2 weeks, if I remember. And we learned how we were going to gather intelligence, develop informants within the hamlets and villages, And then we would run operations to basically intercept and either neutralize or capture some of the political people of the Viet Cong infrastructure. And these were people like tax collectors, recruiters that would come into villages at night, proselytize, try and get young males to join their cause. And they were very persuasive, very articulate, and again, developing these informants in the villages was difficult because you never knew who was a VC sympathizer or somebody who was truly, part of the South Vietnamese government at that time and was pro South Vietnamese government. Once we would get informants, our primary operation was called a cordon and search. I was now at the district level, and the district level was much more primitive. I have photos of where I lived. It was an old French fort left over from when the French were there. Very tiny compound, out in the middle of nowhere. No roads to speak of. And pretty much we could be resupplied by helicopter or a tracked vehicle. And, although at this particular compound where I lived and we worked out of was my advisory team consisted of myself, a senior district advisor was usually a captain or a major. There was a medical expert or a medic. There was a communications expert and a small arms expert. And this is pretty much what your team was. Oh, and a MAT team leader. MAT was a mobile advisory team who traveled around with the different regional force and popular force companies that would train them. The regional force company that was responsible for the security of our compound was Regional Force Company 861. They were led by a Vietnamese captain, Captain An, who I became quite close with. He was probably one of the bravest men I've ever met in my life. And I can attest to that to the 2 times that our compound was attacked at night. I can get into that a little bit later. But basically what we would do is, I mentioned a cordon and search. What we would do is take the RF company, usually consisted of anywhere between 120 and 160 soldiers. We would cordon off a village or a hamlet by moving in at dusk. And we would completely surround the village or the hamlet. And at that point, no one could leave and nobody could go into the hamlet. So whoever was there at the time, that was it. The next morning, after spending the night in the field, I would go in with a team, usually about, I would say probably 8 to 15 soldiers, and we would get people to provide us with their ID cards, their South Vietnamese ID cards. If you didn't have a card, you shouldn't be there. And you basically became a prisoner. Those people were interrogated. Some we found to be VC sympathizers who were there. They shouldn't have been there. Another type of operation, if we received a intelligence from one of our informants within a village that he happened to know that that night the VC were going to be sending in a recruiter to or a tax collector or a political person to try and get either money or medical equipment or food, or a lot of these villages had stashes of ammunition and other arms. We would set up ambushes, and on those ambushes, I would basically go out with a team of maybe a squad and a half, maybe 10 to 15 people. We would set up an L-shaped ambush, and if the people that we suspected or received intelligence on were to arrive, we would first try to capture them, of course, to gain additional intelligence through interrogation, but a lot of times it didn't work out that way, and you ended up in a firefight. And we took casualties, they took casualties, and that was pretty much my my life over there for probably I was in the district level for, I would say probably 8 months out of the time I was there. In addition, we would come off patrols. We would look for weapons caches. We would go into a village, and once again the village would be cordoned off. Nobody could leave or come into the village or the hamlet. And we would look for weapons caches, and we found lots and lots of weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, food, all kinds of tons of rice that would come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would basically, since we were right on the Cambodian border, it would move into these villages, and it was stored there for when the Viet Cong would need these particular items. Back at our own facility, I said it was an old French fort, I believe it was, and we would, it was myself and the 5 other advisors that I told you about, and this one regional force company that was responsible for basically the security of the compound. Because I was a MACV advisor, all my support came from the South Vietnamese. I was given a stipend each month along with a paycheck, that in order for me to procure food for myself, I bought all my food on the local economy or from the local economy. I ate a lot of dried fish and rice balls in those days, because occasionally I could score some sea rations from, we had a huge American base camp in Tay Ninh City itself. It was comprised of elements from the 25th Infantry Division and the 1st Air Cavalry Mobile at this base. But when this base was like a city, it was probably the size of, well, not the Hartford, but the size of our town here. It was huge. And there were numerous aviation battalions there to support the infantry units. There were numerous mechanized cavalry, tanks, APCs, and personnel carriers and things like that. So we were able from time to time get fuel for our Jeeps. We could get food, we could get ammunition, but mostly I had to rely on the Vietnamese and the local economy for my food and other sustenance. Because we were being very successful in the Phoenix program where I was, our compound became a target for frequent we would try to be overrun. We would take numerous mortar and rocket attacks. Several times they actually got into the wire, and one particular night I was asleep, had to be like maybe 0200, 0300. There were huge explosions, and we had mortar pits within the compound, and you could tell the difference between an outgoing mortar round and something that was coming in. And basically the VC had gotten cut through the wire. They had got inside the compound, and they tossed these satchel charges into our TOC, which is our Tactical Operations Center, which was the radio communications and basically the command center for the compound. The satchel charges immediately killed everybody that was in the compound. This captain I spoke to you earlier of, Captain An, rallied the troops. It was very unusual for them to actually get inside the wire, but when they did, all hell broke loose. They were firing RPGs at the rocket-propelled grenades and other small arms fire inside. It's very difficult for us because you could be shooting inside and shooting a friendly on the other side of the compound. You didn't know. The people inside the Viet Cong had to be eliminated. Captain Han stood on top of a bunker in clear view of what was going on and rallied the troops, and eventually they did eliminate all the people that had gotten into the compound. At that point, myself, the other advisors, and the rest of the RF company, we went to the berm line, and basically were fighting off the attack. And they would come where they had tried to break through the wire, where they had gotten through the wire and got into the compound. They continually sent people, and things would get quiet for a while, and then they would hit another side of the compound. It was just a big perimeter. I mentioned earlier that there was this huge base camp in Tainan City, and there were numerous fire bases surrounding us. We couldn't call in artillery because basically we would be calling it in on ourselves. It was that close. The next guess was, or next best bet would be at that time to see if we could get helicopters airborne from this base camp to at least drop flares and light up the area so we could see where the attacks were coming from. And the problem was that there was a very low ceiling that night, and the helicopters didn't want to fly. At that point, it was basically us against them. However, it was just prior to dawn, the helicopters came. They dropped flares. These are parachute flares that basically turn night into day. And you could see what was happening. Basically, after that, gunships came online, and it was basically a slaughter. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. In the morning, when I got up, I had, I think, probably 11 or 12 empty magazines around me. That's well over 200 rounds. I would have probably 5 pounds of empty brass sitting. There were no casualties among the advisors, and I believe there were probably about, additionally to the first 5 people that were killed in the Tactical Operations Center, I believe we lost about, I think it was another 8 or 9 Vietnamese soldiers from the regional forces. And that happened a couple of times while I was there. Those were the scary part. That was the scary part, more so than the ambushes and the cordon and search missions. But for the most part, I'm going to get to the end of my tour pretty much after, when I had about 2 weeks left. During that period of time, I also did manage to take an R&R. I went to Taipei, China. It was a great experience, and it was a nice rest considering what we had been going through. 2 weeks prior to my deroasing, going back to the United States, they brought the advisory team, or the people that were ready to go home, down to Saigon. We were put into a village that had tennis courts, swimming pools, horseback riding, and basically we were, once again, I guess they were preparing us to go back to the world and start our lives, I guess. I flew home. I left Tan Son Nhut, flew to Yokota, Japan, then to Anchorage, Alaska, and then on down to Trefz Air Force Base in Northern California in the San Francisco area. I remember getting off the plane, and there was this huge sign, welcome home soldiers, America's proud of you. We came in, they gave us a big steak dinner, and you're talking about a whole plane full of people. It was a couple hundred people. And they put us up for the night and got us ready to, some of the soldiers still had time left to serve. I had completed now my 2 years of active duty, and at that point was going to be discharged. I started the paperwork for processing out of the military, and had gone, I guess we were there a couple of days. I purchased some civilian clothes. In fact, they told us that they would prefer that once we leave, we should wear civilian clothes because of the protesters would probably give us a hard time upon leaving. The only caveat there was that in those days, in order for you to fly commercially and receive the military discount, you had to fly in uniform. I decided that I didn't want to go back to New York right away. I needed some time to acclimate myself to what was going on. I left Trefz Air Force Base. I had been discharged. I flew to, because I was stationed in California, I flew to Monterey just to, spend some time there. It was such a beautiful place. I did have a girl that I was dating at the time there. She was a school teacher, and she was living at a house with another school teacher. She said, you can, come stay with us. She had written me in Vietnam, just like Eugenie did the whole time. And when I got there, I had to fly in uniform, and when she picked me up from the airport and took me to the house, her roommate, I was introduced to her roommate, and her roommate said, "Oh, I see you have a lot of ribbons on your uniform." And I said, "Yeah." And she says, "Well, how many babies did you kill to get those?" And I said, I had no idea this was going to happen. They tried to prepare us for it, but whatever. And I also told the girl that I had dated, I said, it's probably better off. And she asked me to leave, not the girl, but the roommate. And I said, it's probably better off that I leave and go away. I'll stay in a hotel, and we go out to dinner or whatever. And I stayed there a few days. I then made arrangements to go to Southern California. The my RTO from Vietnam, he was an enlisted person. I believe at this point he was an E5 sergeant. He had made arrangements to take a 30-day leave and then go back to Vietnam for 3 months, and then he would be given an early out. He didn't have to serve his entire 2 years of his draft. So he had taken leave at the same time that I had been discharged. He had lived in Southern California, Orange County, very conservative people. He invited me down to spend some time with him and his family. You have to remember, I forgot to tell. All this time, I was carrying a war trophy home. It was a Viet Cong's rifle, an assault weapon. Can you imagine walking through airports carrying a weapon? Maybe that's why the protesters didn't bother me. I don't know, but I had the weapon, but I had bought a case to carry it in from a Saigon street vendor. Wasn't very well put together. And by the time I even got to Travis, it had pretty much disintegrated. So here I am walking through airports with this war trophy. Today, you can't imagine that would happen. But I spent a couple of days with, his name was Doug, and, visited some bars, had some good times. He introduced me to some of his friends. And then that was it. I flew home, back to New York, and pretty much that ended my career.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Yes, I received the Bronze Star, the Army Commendation Medal. From the South Vietnamese country, I received their Cross of Gallantry and their Medal of Honor. I have certificates here to show you, but you can see all that.
Going back a little bit, while you were in Vietnam, did you keep in touch with your family while you were there?
Oh yes, oh yes.
How did you do that?
Pretty much, I did mostly letters, but at that time they invented this wonderful thing called a cassette recorder, and I would take photos, and I would more or less on a cassette recorder narrate what each photo was about. And I would send those home. They were very appreciative to get those because it gave kind of a picture of what was going on. And of course, my wife Eugenie would send me cassettes. At that time, we had not made any kind of commitment to ourselves at that time, but we did correspond for the whole time I was there.
And while you were there, how did you handle the stress of being there?
Did a lot of drinking. Pretty much. Stress. I guess after a while, you just learn to get past it. I mean, the very first firefight I was in, I had no idea what it was going to be like. And I survived that, and I said, well, you just got to be calm. You just got to do your job. Do what you were trained to do. Stay alive.
And when you went back to New York, what did you do when you got back? Did you go to school or did you go?
I did. Well, I went back to Wall Street to the brokerage house that I had worked for when I was drafted. They were wonderful. Actually gave me my old position back with a significant raise. But I knew I wanted to complete my education. So very shortly after that, I reapplied to continue my education at the University of South Florida. When I left, I was completed enough credits for a sophomore. They did accept my 32 weeks of Vietnamese language school and my officer candidate school and the School of Engineering. And basically between the School of Engineering and Southeast Asian Studies, I received an entire year worth of credits, which was great. So all of a sudden now I'm coming back. I'm a junior, completed, and had one additional year to complete my education and earn my BS degree.
Did you use the GI Bill?
I did.
And I know you mentioned that one friend, the radio operator.
Yeah.
Did you keep in touch with anyone else?
Yes. I have a couple of friends in California. I have a friend and his wife. I believe they now live in Montana. Another friend in Philadelphia. Not a lot of them. Kind of, when I came home, I just kind of wanted to forget about that whole thing. You know, I'm back at a major university now. When I started there in 1965, women had to be in the dorm by 10 o'clock at night during the week and midnight on the weekends. Now, 3 years later, I'm back. People are smoking dope in these large classes. Dorms are co-ed. It was like culture shock in reverse, coming from Vietnam back to how much the university had changed in that period of time. And, when I started there, if you had a beer in the dorm, you were automatically expelled. No questions. That was it. Now I come back and, people are, had bars in their room, for crying out loud. Things were totally different, totally different.
How did your military experience influence your thinking about war and the military in general?
That's a difficult question. When I came home, I wasn't so. When you're going through training, you become indoctrinated. You get a little bit gung ho about things. You start to believe in what you're doing. You start to really think I'm doing the right thing, and everything is going along here, and I can't wait to get over there. And well, that all changed. That all changed. At that particular time when I was there, Nixon had just become president. He had started the Vietnamization, where we were mainly turning the war back over to the Vietnamese people. Pacification, winning the hearts and minds. You got to be kidding me. We weren't winning anybody's hearts and minds, that's for sure. And now when I came home, I basically had done a 180. I wasn't so sure we should have been there. I wasn't protesting, but one of the courses I took while I was there, and I believe it was a statistics course, we were given an assignment to create a oh boy, what do I want to say this? We were supposed to go out and question students, a survey. I'm getting a little old. I lose my words every now and then. We had to create a survey and statistically analyze the results of this survey. The survey I chose to do was whatever president it was that had offered amnesty to the draft dodgers that went to Canada. They were given amnesty, and of course they were all brought back, no questions asked. And I put together a survey, one question, and I basically, do you agree or disagree with the giving this free ticket, free ride to these people that left the country to become not deserters, but draft dodgers and went to Canada. And surprisingly, the results of the survey, I probably talked to, I would say, 50, 60 students, females, males. The results were that most people did not agree with the policy of granting amnesty to these draft dodgers. Now, I'm in a southern school. I would tend to believe that they were a little bit more, I'm not going to say pro-Vietnam, but I think a little bit more tolerant of the war and what was going on there. I mean, when I returned to the university for my final year, Eugenie and I had gotten married that summer, and many of my fraternity brothers from the first 2 years were now back. They were all Vietnam veterans. They were there with their wives, and that's the group we chose to hang around with, so to speak, party with, get to know. And I think all of them had a 180 on their feelings for the war, what they had done there, and pretty much at this point they were just being quiet about it. I never told anybody that I didn't know that I was a Vietnam veteran. Never. I mean, people who knew that I was a Vietnam veteran, well, I couldn't very much deny it. But as I met new people, I never really told anybody that I had been to Vietnam.
Did you join any veterans organizations like the VFW or anything?
No, no, I did not. I tried to avoid that.
Is there anything else you would like to add that hasn't been covered in this interview?
I think that pretty much covers everything that happened and everything I did.
I'd like to thank you for your service and also for taking the time to be interviewed today.
Great. Thank you.